It's one of the fallacies of education that we would think that if people just knew better, they would do better. As a matter of fact, almost all education is built on that theory that if we could just teach people everything they ought to know, it would change all of their actions. The reality is, none of us live as well as we know. I always have liked the story of the guy that was selling the Progressive Farmer, and he went out to an old farmer to try to get him to subscribe to his magazine, and he was telling him about all of the things that it would teach him about row cropping, about fertilizer, about how to do different things to make for a better crop. And the farmer said, "I don't farm half as well as I know already." And that's about the way it is with life itself. We tend not to do nearly as well as we know. Most of the things that we question in life, we instinctively know better than we actually will admit. So many things that people say, well, if I just knew what God wanted me to do, I'd do it. And yet, if they really think about it, most of them do have a pretty clear knowledge of what God wants in given situations. You know, there's so many times in the Bible itself that it will say, and this is the will of God. And so when I read those texts and it comes from the Spirit of God, I know pretty clearly what God wants out of my life in given situations. It's a matter of having the will to do the things that really are the will of God for my life. God wants our life to be morally pure. He wants us to live a spiritually minded life. He wants us to walk by faith day by day. Over in 1 Thessalonians 4, when Paul was describing that Christian life, he said, this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you would avoid sexual immorality. And he goes on and lays out a list of things involved in the will of God. James made the statement that to him that knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. And there's so many things in life that we just know that we ought to do. Someone is hurting in some way, and we know that we ought to do something to help. A child is crying and wondering and afraid, and we know that we ought to do something that would help in that situation. There's so many problems in our world that we know fully that we have a place to fill and a job that needs to be done. And yet, the problem of doing is such a big matter with us that we struggle with carrying out those things that we often plan to do. I think it's that Paul had in mind in Romans 7 when he said, I have the will to do the right thing, and I make up my mind I'm going to do it, but then I find myself doing the wrong thing. And I find that there's another law in my members, not just that law to determine to do right, but a law that pulls me down, that causes me to do the very things that I said I wouldn't do, or to fail to do the very things that I said I would do. Knowing and doing, well, they sometimes go together, but quite often our knowing level is way ahead of our doing level. It'd be great if we could bring our doing level up to where we were doing the things that we knew that we ought to do all along.